Hello, my name is Meriem Chabani. I was lucky to be one of the LINA platform fellows in 2022. It's been 2 years, and I'm honored to be invited back to share my experience, but also reflect on the processes that have emerged out of this fellowship, how they have allowed me to grow into my practice, and what are the seeds for the future. And hopefully that's a conversation that we can have collectively. But I will very much start from a personal experience. So in 2022, we applied together with my practice New South and an engineer that we were collaborating with, Radi Ben Hadid, on a project entitled Mukarnas. The project that we submitted for consideration was a very practical one. It was an experimentation around the notion of sacred architecture as a possible realm for innovation and exploration, and kind of reinstating knowledge, practices, and expertise from the global south, kind of using this lens of the sacred to shift the conversation and bring to the forefront of contemporary architectural discourse the role of the sacred as a notion for innovation. And so it was kind of through this narrative surrounding, this reversal of orders of value between global north and global south, that the notion of the sacred came to mind, and that I became exploring kind of the various way this very wide, difficult to pin down notion could have for architecture. And then things evolved, and I'd like to share with you what followed. So sacred grounds became this notion that I started to take apart and try and look at from different perspectives. And there's one extremely important conversation that started to happen when, also discussing with other people what sacred as a notion meant. What was really interesting to see is that obviously places of worship are almost an automatic and very immediate response. It's the obvious materialization of that notion into space and architecture. But is that what we are limited to? I like this photo of Sebastião Salgado because it describes very vividly the cost that human bodies go through to sustain themselves. So these are photos from miners and the Serra Pelada mines. These gold mines have been closed since, but it's such an evocative image of capitalist extractivism, of human bodies confronted with the transformation of land, the transformation of the earth to serve the production of value. And as architects, we're very familiar with the cost associated with our work. This is not a new conversation. We are very aware. Hopefully, this is something that has become mainstream, that architecture equals extraction. Architecture equals the destruction for the creation of something new. There's a transfer of matter. And obviously, there's a wider conversation to have about sustainable ways to engage with this relationship to the earth for the production of spaces and for placemaking. But we are very much embedded in a system that relies on a heavily extractive ways to sustain the making of our contemporary cities. And so basically what we see here down the line is the main driver behind the making of our cities, which is one order value, money. Within a capitalist system, we know that we are embedded in a system that is driven and is sustained by the pursuit of monetary value, of the increasing of this value through time, and of unfavorable power dynamics when it comes to what is being sacrificed and what is being devoured to allow for this value to be generated and to grow. And so that kind of begs the question, is there any alternative form of value, kind of counterpower, that could be put and set in front of such an all-encompassing driving force? And this is where the notion of sacredness holds so much potential and so much power. In his book, The States of the Earth, Mohammed Meriem provides a historical rereading of the process of secularization in Europe, with a specific focus on ecology and on how secularization became the force that allowed capitalist extractivism to rise. This is a summary, and I truly encourage you to become more familiar with this work. It exists in English and in French under the title Des Empires sous la Terre. And without going into too much detail, what's really interesting here is looking at historical proof of how the killing of invisible life, the killing, the erasing of any form of potential counterpower coming out of the earth, kind of coming from this idea that if there are no dragons, no spirits, no demons that might come and bite my hand as I'm digging it deep in the earth and taking from it, then there's really no limit to the amount of extraction that may take place. One powerful example of this relationship between sacred and profane within the environment is the work that forensic architecture and Imani Jacqueline Brown have been conducting in Louisiana in the Mississippi River. And here this photo shows what they call a sacred grove, which is this clump of trees in the middle of this agricultural land. And so we have this very strong contrast between productive and non-productive landscape facing one another. The reason for this, and the reason for the very existence of this anomaly, is that these sacred groves, to this day, are the remnants of burial grounds from enslaved people in the Mississippi area. There are hundreds of such sites that remain to this day, hundreds more that were probably destroyed. But what's very powerful to see is also kind of looking in the background at these oil rigs and new forms of extraction that are taking place on this land, is the survival and the enduring existence of this profoundly non-productive land through the power of its sacred nature, through the taboo of death and the very clear sanctuary, the nature and the quality of sanctuary that is associated with these places. And so faced with this idea and kind of trying to take this to the logical conclusion as an architect, the conversation really should go towards Okay, but then how do we try and understand how the notion of sacred can be used within architecture, both theoretically, but also very practically? How can we take this notion and try and implement it within our practices, but also how can we identify places that fit this description in order to go and look for the right tools and go and look for the right examples and frameworks that we can build from. And so based on that, I would propose 4 principles that can hopefully help us move a bit beyond, kind of this reading of the sacred simply as churches and mosques and temples, but also as ordinary, everyday forms of placemaking, and what are the qualities that would make them sacred. And so the first value and kind of the first principle that we can try and use to identify that is a principle of reciprocity. What I mean by reciprocity is really, framework that would be opposite to extractivism. It would be a framework where the taking, the borrowing from the land, in order to build, in order to create shelter for humans, would operate within a relationship of give and take. Here we have examples of in North America, Canada, and the United States of culturally modified trees, which describes trees where some specific and targeted don't want to use the word extraction, but I'm struggling to find the right kind of this boring, this taking, but this very targeted, there's a word for it, prélèvement, this sampling, yes, of materials out of the land is done in a way where it is non-destructive. So, for example, the trees live on; they keep growing. The planks and the bark and wood timber that has been sampled out of that tree does not prevent it from growing and multiplying. And actually, to this day, these trees are giving back to the humans that cared for them, since we have indigenous people in Canada and the United States that are actually fighting in the courts for the rights to lands that have these culturally modified trees that mark both their place and the indigenous presence within that land through that reciprocity that took place within that land. Second notion, which is kind of adjacent to something that we're all talking about right now, is maintenance, or in other words, also care. And so maintenance is this idea that beyond the idea of constructing a place, what really sanctuarizes it and what maintains its status as a sacred place is the sustained care, attention, and maintenance that will be provided to this place throughout time. And here we see images of the replastering of the mosques of Djenné in Mali. It's a very famous building. It's famous for a good reason. So it's an earth building that's more than 100 years old. The reason for its survival to this day, and the fact that it thrives, and it's a building that has not only been maintained throughout time, but is actually getting even thicker to a point where the structure, the wooden structure inside, is almost getting threatened, but the walls are very, very well taken care of, is the fact that every year the whole community, people all around the city, get together to prepare and implement the maintenance of this earth structure. And so it is through an act of community, it is through an act of care that this mosque and its sacred nature as a place of worship is kind of reinforced and reiterated, reaffirmed throughout time. And we could very well imagine such acts of collective care being applied to ordinary architectures and not necessarily places of worship. The third principle would seem kind of obvious, which is the places of rituals. And here I really want us to try and take a kind of wider definition of what these rituals might be. Not simply rituals of prayer, but also kind of acts that are being repeated that we might not necessarily understand the reason why. And we have rituals that are associated with construction, ceremonies of breaking ground, ceremonies of wrapping up construction, but also, depending on different cultures, various forms of rituals that might be connected to a specific locale and to a specific climate, to a specific culture, that really indicate that there is a point of interest and that there is something that kind of goes beyond our understanding that's embedded in a place. If we allow ourselves to look at these rituals and the repetition of these acts in space, we might learn, one, how to better embed construction within a context, but also to try and make sure that these rituals feed into any form of placemaking that might take place later on. And finally, fourth point to look for and try and make sure to maintain within our practices is the act of anchoring. And anchoring kind of going from this idea that buildings may have roots, roots that may go deeper than simply, you know, construct a constructive or technical approach to construction, but ways in which an architecture may relate to environments and engage in creating long-lasting relationship with it. One good example, for example, is the Senufo houses in Ivory Coast. And so what we see with the Senufo people is, you know, mud architecture, earth architecture, that is linked also to a practice of burying the dead underneath the family house. So throughout time, we have the bodies of the ancestors that decompose and return to dust, return to the earth underneath the very ground where their descendants are living. And, you know, the maintenance of that building, the replastering of it, really creates this deep relationship between this earth that is now charged with the remains of the ancestors and the house that is being currently inhabited by their descendants. And it's both a very deep and very specific relationship that is being sustained here that really opens up new ways also to kind of see the interconnection between the four principles. So this is the kind of the framework that we can adopt, try and make sure that we implement and look for sacred practices of the built environment. And I want to take you to one example of a project that we are currently working on that's unfortunately, I've been talking a lot about taking this beyond places of worship, but I still do need to talk to you about places of worship, especially in contexts where places of worship are being desacralized, or where, acts of sacred visibility are both criminalized or increasingly excluded from the public realm. So I'm an Algerian-born, Paris-based architect. The project that I want to discuss is one that's based in France, which is a secular country with a very sour and conflicting relationship to the various religions that it houses, and one more than others, more specifically. So I'm curious to see what you observe on this photo, because this photo has been taken within the streets of Paris, and it's a photo where we can see the entrance to a mosque. One very popular mosque, actually. I used to work right nearby, and we would see regularly people coming and going, especially on Fridays, to attend the prayer. But I doubt you'll be able to identify where it is based on this photo. It's right there in the foreground. And so when we think of mosques, we often have these types of images in mind. This is the Grande Mosquée de Paris. It's the biggest mosque in Paris. It's the most famous one. It's arguably the only one who's not really a mosque as well, as it's very much become a tourist landmark, and it's not so much used by the local Muslim communities as a place of prayer. And it's a building that says a lot about also how that religion and how the practice of that religion is seen within that context. You might notice that this building is very distinctly different from its surroundings. It's a building that was erected between the First and the Second World War. It's very much a colonial present. So it's a present from France to its Muslim indigenous communities that have served, and I use indigenous really more specifically referring to the term indigène, which was the word used to describe colonized people from the lands that France was occupying at the time, that did not have the same status as citizens of France. And so what we see here is an architecture that borrows from then French colonies, Morocco and Tunisia more specifically. And unfortunately, what this does is that it kind of reinstates the idea that the expression of that religion within the public realm, within the city, is one of a foreign and alien form of sacred practice. And unfortunately, this is something that becomes even more problematic when we look at the prevalence or the lack thereof of places of worship for Muslims in France, and more specifically in Paris. So what you see on this map, the white dots, the small white dots are places of prayer. The bigger white dots are buildings, so mosques that are actually buildings. They're not undergrounds or just one level spaces of prayer, but rather something. Sorry, I'm in Paris, which you might hear. In the background, it's a very lively city, and unfortunately, it's a lively city that is struggling to provide enough spaces of prayer to its Muslim community. So we made a quick calculation, and we estimate that in 2012, the city was able to cover about 3% of the needs of people who wanted to pray within a mosque. And then there's the second question of what do these places actually look like? But this map represents the situation in 2012. The green squares are not mosques, but they're actually they are informal prayer spaces that you would find in, foreign workers housing. So I'm sorry, because I'm trying to look for the right way to translate it. So in English, in French, sorry, the name for it is Foyer de Travailleurs Migrants. So it's housing for foreign migrant workers. And so these places, which really were dedicated to single men mostly, who would come work in France. And the idea was that they come, they work in low-paying, low-grade jobs, and then they would go back to their countries. However, things change and these populations stayed and their need for prayer spaces stayed. However, there has been a transformation of these social housing units, meaning that these places, these informal places of worship, have actually disappeared. This work is still being conducted today. So like this refurbishment of these places is still being conducted today. So if we look at the situation that is projected for 2028, what we're looking at is even less spaces for prayer within Paris than what we used to have in 2012. Faced with this situation, and with, the certainty that the situation will only get worse, what we can naturally infer is that the places of worship that already exist will have to accommodate even more people and the needs of an increasing population that is struggling to find places for prayer. And this is where we have been requested to work on a mosque that currently exists within Paris in the 11th arrondissement. So this photo is a photo of the current mosque. You might notice a pattern is that outside of the Grande Mosquée de Paris, the other places of worship within Paris are almost impossible to identify as not just mosques, but as places of value. And so here what we see is what used to be a paper factory that has been transformed into a mosque in the 70s and has operated as one since, with the capacity to house about 400 people per prayer, but demands going much, much higher. And, our clients asking us to see how we could host more than 1,000 people to pray in this place. This is a photo of what happens on a Friday. So it's a very tense situation where you see hundreds of people come and gather outside of this place, waiting for their turn to go and pray. There's so little space and so much demand that the people operating the mosque are organizing 3 prayers instead of one big prayer on Fridays. They have to have 3 prayers back to back with an imam kind of leading the prayer back to back 3 times to make sure that everyone gets a chance to gather and pray. And then obviously there's the question of what is the state of the installations and what kind of care and value is put into the conditions that people go through to pray. And as we can see, this is an old building. It's in a rather derelict state. So when we were requested to work on the transformation of this mosque with the idea of, taking it from its current state to what would be a French mosque that would work in the 21st century, but also above all, this demand to make sure that this would be a French and not a pastiche of a North African, Middle Eastern, or African place of worship, but something that would be fully embedded in its neighborhood, fully embedded in the needs of its community, and something that would reflect both the aesthetic, the programmatic needs, and the functionality that would make sense for its users. And so we spent a year not designing anything, which was a struggle, but just talking and engaging in various conversations and workshops with both the local and a wider Parisian Muslim community. Because obviously there are the people who attend prayer at the mosque now, but there are also the people who are invisible, who cannot attend, who do not want to attend because of the state of the installations or because of the lack of connection between their needs and what is being currently provided. And what emerged from that work very early on was that form was such a secondary concern, and really principles of, sustainability, the presence of light, the presence of nature, the role of community, of communal placemaking within that space were actually at the forefront of the conversations. Matters of gender inclusion, matters of age inclusion as well, making sure that we do not cater to one age group more than another. All of this was what slowly drove us to rewrite and precise the program that would give birth to the design itself. And so shifting from conversations, shifting from community engagement to the translation into design is always such a tricky part of our work. And so we were like, okay, if we put everything in the garbage can, and if we get rid of, the usual signifiers of what a mosque is, meaning, Arabic, Andalusian motif, domes, minarets, and kind of elements that are reproduction of very practical technical solutions to needs that in this case just did not apply. For example, we couldn't have a minaret because even if we wanted to, you can't call for prayer in public space in France. So it kind of becomes an organ with no use, and a remnant, a ghost, a reminder of what's lacking, rather than a representation of how the building really operates. And so we're like, okay, so we put all that to the side. What's left? And what are the spatial elements we should be working with? And this photo is very evocative of really the main principles and the main drivers behind mosque design. And it comes down to three. So the first one is the delimitation. It's the demarcation between profane space and sacred space. So as I move from my everyday life, from the streets, I step into a space where I will remove my shoes. I will go through a process of cleansing myself to make myself ready to perform prayer. So that's the first principle, simply kind of a border. Then obviously there's the matter of direction. Always pray towards Mecca. And then the final one is the capacity for communal prayer. So instead of praying by myself, which I can do anywhere, a mosque is about praying together. And with these three very simple principles, you kind of strip things down to the most essential drivers behind the making and the designing of a mosque. And then here in our case, we're like, okay, this is clear. However, we're in Paris, have a small plot, 300 square meters, which is quite small. And the only possibility for this mosque to host more people is for it to grow vertically. We are in a dense urban context. And so suddenly we need to find a way to apply these principles in a stacked manner, in a vertical design. And we're like, okay, so we know how to make this function kind of in terms of volume. And then obviously there are various technical matters to solve that are linked to like urban regulations, security, fire regulations as well, meaning that, you know, stairs and elevators are going to take up quite a lot of room. It's about 1/3 of the square meters of the area per floor is taken up simply by stairs. And so we spent another couple of months simply working, you know, on making things work technically. But then eventually we did have to confront what we were the most scared of, which was the face and the symbolism, the aesthetic of that building. What would be the right language here? And for that, we needed to find signifiers within the religion itself. And we decided to rely on two. The first one is, it comes from Ayatun Nur. It's the description of God as Nur ala Nur. So kind of light reflected upon light. And we're like, okay, light, that's an element that's very much architectural. We know that's something that we can work with. Let's make that a driving element in our design. And then the second one is time and rhythm. And so when you look at the practice of Muslim worship, one very obvious thing that comes to mind is the fact that you have 5 prayers a day. These are connected to both the moon and the sun. And so we have something that's so deeply connected to time, the passing of time, to an astral calendar. And so bodies move in and out of that state of prayer, in and out of profane and sacred states throughout the day. That also applies throughout the week, obviously, with, you know, one big prayer a week. And then we have big events and cultural, religious moments throughout the year. But so this movement that comes from the temporality of worship really seemed to be such an important driving force to maintain and sustain in the design of a contemporary mosque. And so we drafted this concept of a mosque that would behave in 2 ways. It could be a place that reflects light, that can be shuttered and reflect the light that surrounds it. But it could also be a place that emits light, that kind of becomes almost like a lighthouse within urban public space. And we wanted to find a way to be playful on the movement between one and the other, but also kind of as a reaction, as a response to the various strategies of invisibilization that we had observed of places of Muslim worship in Paris and in France. And so we came up with this design of a place that would actually transform throughout time. It's a building that is covered with a metallic mesh that opens and closes depending on how the people within it want it to behave. So, for example, when everyone is praying, they might want some privacy and close the facade. However, when the building operates otherwise, because also this movement will be present even within the occupation of the mosque. So today, outside of prayer, what we see is, people teaching math classes, French classes, various types of homework help, or, proper diffusion of knowledge, sharing of knowledge within that space. So that's something that we wanted to nurture and give the capacity for this place of worship to also operate as a community center, as a cultural center, outside of the times when it is a prayer space. And so the whole thing is designed with these plateaux that can host a variety of uses, but that are all designed with prayer in mind, meaning that we have the first two floors that actually are a library, but it's a library that also operates as a prayer space. So every single space becomes like a polyvalent, multi-purpose prayer room. The facade is made out of a gold and silver metallic mesh. It's a nod to the working class history of the neighborhood that is based on metalwork. So right in front of this mosque, we have what is called the Maison des Métallos, which is a famous cultural but also political place of organizing for metal workers and more generally working class people from the neighborhood. So if we look at how things operate inside this mosque, these are two samples of the same space and how it operates when it's prayer time or when it operates as a profane space. So various forms of textile, both that metal mesh outside, but also inside, getting rid of any forms of walls or partition walls to instead fully rely on textile, on curtains, and various forms of sound acoustic management to recreate smaller spaces, to recreate classrooms, to create workspaces. Everything kind of comes from this need for this space to move and to evolve easily, using any body and body of any size to transform it, kind of very easily repartitioning or reopening this space. So the reason why I'm sharing this project is to look at very practically the consequences of engaging with the sacred as a series of signifiers and a series of, like, a framework of value that can have a deep impact on how we design both a place of worship, and hopefully this is something that also we want to demonstrate in everyday, ordinary architectures that are so structural to our lives. And I feel like we are all confronted today with, an increasing sense of loss when it comes to sanctuaries. We are witnessing destruction at scales that we haven't seen since the Second World War. We're witnessing the acts, like deliberate acts of desanctuarization, of specifically targeting places that would have been deemed safe, would have been deemed sacred, would have been deemed sanctuarized. And so faced with this crisis of value, this crisis that kind of really confronts us with what happens when we take that away from cities, when we take that away from also our collective consciousness. I want us to actively re-engage with this notion and see how we may rebuild the world, fully relying on the values that we are being robbed of. I hope that the conversation that we will have in a year from now will be different. I hope that we will look back at the reconstruction of sanctuaries. I hope that we will look back at the recreation of safe spaces. I think that our work today very much needs to be focused on making that happen. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you very much for creating a platform where these conversations can happen. And I really want to also take the time to thank the whole team from the LINA platform that has been fighting every day to create a place of togetherness in a world where separation and division is an increasing concern in a world where everything feels a bit more small. Thank you for making sure that we still hold spaces to make it bigger. So thank you very much, and I hope to see you soon.